The Savage Nation.
Once again, we're speaking with a man who I consider to be a hero of mine, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel, an author, consultant, and a PhD. But more than that, he's an active spokesman for the truth. How do you take a man who graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point with a bachelor's in general engineering, who also earned his PhD from the University of Virginia, who has written many books? Not only that, but he directed the Battle of 73 Easting during the Gulf War. This is an astounding man, one of the true Americans, and yet they disparage him wherever you turn. They call him every name under the sun. If you look at Wikipedia, it says his commentary has been noted for disparaging Ukraine, immigrants, and refugees. Isn't that shocking? In other words, when he tells the truth about Ukraine, when he tells the truth about the broken borders, when he tells the truth about the bums living in hotels instead of working, that makes him a villain? No, he's not the villain. He's the hero. This is my new interview with the great Colonel Douglas Macgregor right now on the Michael Savage podcast.
Savage.
Colonel Macgregor, sir. Always a pleasure.
It's nice to see you too.
The man who never stops working, Colonel Douglas Macgregor.
Well, we could say that about you too.
Well, it's up to God, right, by the way, at this point.
Well, everything always is.
Isn't that something? Colonel, before we began, I went on to Wikipedia to just see how they twisted your life.
Oh,
It's a shocker to me. I mean, I know they've done it to me my whole life, but how could they twist the things you've done so completely?
I haven't checked it lately. What are they saying?
Well, I'm reading one here. His commentary has been noted for disparaging Ukraine, immigrants, and refugees. I said, let's start with Ukraine, meaning telling the truth about Zelensky and the fact that these poor Ukrainians are dying like flies in a petri dish. Immigrants, you mean the wonderful non-working folks that Biden's bringing over by the millions who are living in hotel rooms and not working. And you mean refugees? What are you talking about? Everything is backwards, Colonel. Welcome to the program. Let's begin with the real stuff, Colonel. You did a YouTube piece the other day, Is the Ukraine War Lost? Can you give us a short version of that, please?
Well, I think the short version is that Russia has been fighting a defensive war and allowing the Ukrainians to impale themselves on Russian defenses. And they have employed all the modern technology available, from overhead space-based surveillance and every conceivable form of long-range precision strike. And the Ukrainians are now looking at, I think the latest count was an estimated 400,000 dead.
Oh, God.
A satellite picture sent to me recently showed 123,000 freshly dug graves in Ukraine for Ukrainian soldiers.
I posted that and people don't believe me. I said, you can't hide graves with new satellite imagery. And I had an estimate with another gentleman who was on, who I think is a colleague of yours, Larry Johnson, I believe.
Oh, yeah. Larry's very solid.
Larry said 350,000 to me last week.
Yeah.
And now 400,000. And we're seeing estimates of what from the media, Colonel?
Oh, well, I wouldn't worry about anything that comes out of the mainstream media, because only 3 or 4 Ukrainians were accidentally injured in their attack on Russian defenses, and 500,000 Russians are dead as a result. That's absurd.
They twisted their ankles on the way over the barriers to kill those nasty, evil Russians. This is a very serious story. When you have 350 to 400,000 dead Ukrainian men, the country is a very small country at the end of the day. This country can never, ever find the manpower, and I'm using the word manpower, to restore its agricultural and industrial base, can it?
Seems unlikely, because the 14 plus million that have left the country, regardless of where they go, have all said the same thing: we will never go back.
Okay, so this was a massive blunder on the part of the West, in plain English.
Oh, absolutely.
And we understand that by provoking this war, for whatever the reasons are inside the heads of these lunatics, they never admit they're wrong, and they only double down, don't they?
Oh, of course, absolutely. In fact, there's an article that just came out in The Atlantic, written by, I think it's Jeff Goldberg and Ann Applebaum, who are 2 card-carrying globalists neocons, whatever you want to call them. I don't know what you call them anymore other than lunatics. And they are absolutely convinced that Ukraine is going to come through all of this and eventually strike back and retake, quote unquote, Crimea.
Now, wait a minute. These are two idiots from New York City, from the Upper East Side, no doubt, who have never slipped on a banana peel and hurt their asses on the pavement. And they're now dictating what's happening in the war.
Well, who knows? Anne Applebaum married the former foreign minister of Poland. So we can only speculate about the influence of that insanity.
The interlocking marriage directorates. That's a joke. Boy, it's really becoming nepotism everywhere you turn, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the bottom line for your audience is very straightforward, and that is that, yes, this war is effectively lost. However, every attempt that has been made to negotiate an end to this has been spurned by the West. Washington continues to insist that there can be no negotiated settlement until obviously all the Russians have been driven from sacred Ukrainian soil, which of course is nonsense. But the problem is, if you're sitting in Moscow and you listen to this, you say, well, obviously we can't win this war by simply defending what we have. We're going to have to advance. And they have begun advancing up in the northeastern corner of their defense, just south of Kharkov, and they're moving west and a little bit north. It's a slow grind. They're deliberately moving their integrated air defenses and their strike assets forward so that their ground forces are protected. And they're not meeting a great deal of resistance. A lot of Ukrainian forces are melting away. Ukrainians are now surrendering in company-sized elements. That's anywhere from 100 to 200 men at a time.
Wait, just giving up because they know they're going to be made into mincemeat?
I think that's part of it. I also think there's a lot of disillusionment with the entire war. There's a growing awareness that they are being essentially consigned to death for no good reason.
Cannon fodder.
And they have lots of people who are wounded. And a Ukrainian officer looks and says, I want to evacuate my wounded. And he's told, no, we can't evacuate it. You're going to have to fight on. And so
it sounds like Hitler.
Oh, it's worse. It's worse.
Well, wait.
Even the Germans
very serious.
Even the Germans attempted to get their wounded out, for God's sakes.
Are you saying the Zelensky regime is prohibiting retreat?
Well, I think they've been trying to stop it at every turn, and they're shooting people, jailing people, imprisoning people, forcing people into the ranks. They've reached all the way to the Carpathian Mountains to force people into the Ukrainian army now. Listen, this war is a catastrophe for Ukraine. The Ukrainian nation has been destroyed. Even if it stopped tomorrow morning, how long would any of this take to recover? I mean, I read a very strange article that was in the British MOD website. And this British military analyst, or at least claims to be a military analyst, says that, well, one of the problems the Ukrainians have faced in southern Ukraine is that the agricultural area, in other words, the fields, have been fallow for 18 months. And with all of this rain, there has been growth in those fields of lots of shrubbery. And the shrubbery makes it harder for the Ukrainians to identify Russian soldiers fighting them. This has held back the Ukrainians. Now stop and consider this absurd statement. This is the sort of nonsense that passes for serious analysis.
No, wait, the shrubs are preventing the Ukrainians from defeating the Russians?
Yes, that's one of the arguments.
It's the weeds that did it?
Yeah, the weeds are growing.
I think it's the weed that they're smoking. I think it's the weed that they're smoking in the United States Defense Department, frankly.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of that up at the top in Kiev too. So look, this thing is over. There's no question about it. And everybody in Washington, I think, is scrambling. They're trying to figure out how do we conceal this catastrophe from the American people as well as from Europe and escape from the disaster that we've created for ourselves.
Aren't there peace talks ongoing somewhere right now? I read recently that there
not that I'm aware of. I don't know.
I heard that there was some kind of back channel peace discussions, but who would know what's really going on? So the latest provocation that really worried me over the weekend were the drone attacks by Ukraine using NATO-provided Storm Shadow missiles. I think those are Anglo-French creations.
Yes.
And they hit a bridge called the Chonhar Bridge, which links the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine and the southern Kherson region. I said, who the hell is telling? First of all, we were told that the weapons we were sending Zelensky would only be used offensively. That was the first big lie by the U.S. Defense Department. Never aggressively. Well,
Right.
now they're using these advanced Storm Shadow missiles to blow up a major bridge. What do they think Putin is going to do?
Well, we've seen over the last 48 hours what he's going to do. And he essentially launched dozens and dozens of cruise missiles and drones and other forms of precision munitions at a whole range of targets across Ukraine, all the way out to the border with Romania and Poland. So, we know what he's doing, and he's destroying whatever he can find on the ground that supports the Ukrainian war, any equipment that's coming in, any ammunition storage, and now command and control sites. This is a pointless endeavor on the Western side, but here's the bad news. There are a lot of Storm Shadow missiles out there. And even though the Russians, out of say 15 Storm Shadow missiles, shoot down all but 3, the problem is 3 still get through. And when I say we, I'm talking about the United States, France, and Great Britain, are still pushing more and more of these cruise missiles. We may have another 100 or 150 of these available that can be given to the Ukrainians. This doesn't change the outcome of any war. This doesn't alter the situation on the battlefield. It will not save the Zelensky regime, but it prolongs the misery. And it makes it increasingly clear to the Russians that they don't have much choice in the matter. They're going to have to march west. And see, they already have in draft legislation that would add another 500,000 mobilized reservists to the Russian forces. The Russians have 750,000 right now in and around Ukraine. In other words, in Russia, in Belarus, and in southern Ukraine. Of that number, at least 300,000 are sitting in a reserve. They have not been employed. They're being held back because of Putin's concern that we may try to intervene in the West on the ground.
Colonel, that's what worries me the most. If I'm trying to put my head into the mind of the fraternity boys in the Biden administration who are orchestrating this insanity, and I look at them and I see fraternity boys who actually look like fraternity boys pretending to be world leaders on the world stage, they're liable to escalate and say, why don't we just go ahead and send American air power in there and get this over with? I'm sure some of them have said that, Colonel.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's been considered, but thus far rejected. I mean, all we can do is hope that we continue to reject that option, because that opens up really all of Western and most of Eastern Europe to Russian attack because of all the airfields, airstrips, airports that can be used. And remember, the Russian caliber missile, it has a huge 1,000-pound warhead on it. It can be conventional, or it can carry a nuclear warhead. Right now, we know the nuclear warheads are in storage. But that caliber cruise missile can be launched from Russia and hit virtually any target in Europe from Norway to Spain. So how do you
now, the Russians have a phenomenal submarine fleet, as do we.
Yeah, their submarine fleet is good, but I would argue ours is better. It's just not large enough. We need more submarines than we have. But the Russian submarine fleet poses a very serious threat. This is the problem with, we'll just send in our conventional force to buttress the Ukrainians, Poles, or whoever else is there. Well, how do you get your reinforcements across the ocean? We can only fly a fraction of forces across the ocean. The vast majority of equipment and people have to go how? Overseas. How do you cross the oceans when it's full of Russian submarines? Answer, you don't.
Colonel, this past week we saw a joint show of force off Alaska with combined forces of Russia and China on the seas. I'm not surprised by this, but Ice Cream Joe has now unified China and Russia, who were actually not allies before this expedition into Ukraine, Russia. Now we've driven China and Russia together. Where do you think this is going, Colonel?
Well, you've got to get Americans to understand that, contrary to their assumptions, we are not always the guys with the white hats that ride in as everybody's liberator. And frankly speaking, for decades now, we have behaved much like the schoolyard bully who goes
come
around.
on, you can't say that. Now you're Putin's stooge, aren't you?
Yeah,
Colonel?
well, okay, then let's all be stooges. But the bottom line is,
well, who's Zelensky's stooge in the media? Every time I get that on Twitter or Facebook, you're Putin's stooge. You know what I say to them? Peace is patriotic. Hillary Clinton. She said that during the Iraq War. So I quote, "Peace is patriotic" by Hillary Clinton, and they usually stop.
Yeah, it's a good motto, and it's true. Hell, that's been good for the entire 20th century in most cases, but nobody does it. No, I think the problem is that we have been behaving like a schoolyard bully. Do what we say, or we punch you in the nose.
Look what they did. Look what they did to Serbia. You know, I was the only one in the media over 68 days during the bombing. I was literally bleeding on the air, screaming against this because I know the Serbian people were our allies in World War II. They rescued our airmen in World War II. They're wonderful people. They're patriotic people. And here we were supporting basically the Muslim mafia from Kosovo in stealing a piece of Serbia that had been a part of Serbia since the 13th century. But I was screaming into the wind. I just found out that you, I think, shared a similar opinion. I saw that.
Well, I did, but I was on active duty at the time, and I didn't have much choice in the matter. I gave my recommendations to the Supreme Commander Europe, General Wes Clark, and I urged that we not, under any circumstances, bomb Serbia. But I don't think it was in his hands, to be frank. That decision was made in Washington, and I think Berger and Gore and Albright and
Sandy Berger, Mr. Socks.
Yeah, all of those people were involved, and they wanted desperately this war with Serbia. They saw it as an opportunity to administer some kind of object lesson that ultimately would be interpreted in Moscow as a warning.
I wrote an article at the time calling "The Oily Tracks Run Through Kosovo," and it was about an oil pipeline that ran through Kosovo. It was about oil in some ways, I thought. What do you think?
Well, I don't think so. I think it simply had much more to do with the fact that this was another convenient cause that the left in Washington, and I shouldn't say left, it's back to the Uniparty, because you had people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham who were urging that we bomb the Serbs over Kosovo. Anyone who spoke up and urged moderation, and by the way, the German government never gets credit for this, but privately, they were willing to put up enormous sums of money in order to build new cities, new towns, new residences for various people to move them around so that they would feel secure in their respective areas in Kosovo. Of course, that meant some form of partition, which both the Serbs at the time and subsequently the Kosovo Albanians were willing to accept some form of partition. We sabotaged that and insisted that, no, we were going to create this new multi-ethnic, multinational state where everyone would be forced to live together, whether they liked it or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to go back and understand that Serbia really was a sort of testing ground for what ultimately has happened in Ukraine. It was a prelude. We didn't see it that way at the time. But if you look at the media, they were screaming at the tops of their lungs about so-called Serb atrocities. And when we looked at these things carefully, we didn't see the evidence for the atrocities on the scale that were argued. And
we're hearing about Russian atrocities right now over and over again, the same big lie.
Yeah, it is. It's a big lie. But, you know, this is the problem. We are dealing with a group of people in power in Washington who are losing power. Let's face it, the United States is in a deplorable condition. We're watching this business of going through de-dollarization and gold-backed in much of the world. It's just beginning. It hasn't reached fruition, but it is beginning. This is a direct challenge to our financial hegemony, which is vitally important to us given our miserable condition in terms of sovereign national debt. Then we have the military problem. We have really gutted the armed forces in so many ways, harmed it in moral terms, harmed its discipline, its fighting power, yet we're spending almost $1 trillion on it. And we openly admit that if we had to fight the Russians or the Chinese or both, that we would lose.
You mean the new military couldn't beat the Russians to death with the high heels that are being issued?
apparently not.
Colonel, let's take a pause of speaking with the great Colonel Douglas Macgregor. And CNN, just even CNN, as left-wing as it is, just released their own poll, which states that the majority of Americans oppose OPPOSE, more U.S. aid for Ukraine in their war with Russia. And yet the Pentagon, Congress, Biden, and the media are so removed from the people's will, they won't even quote a CNN poll. So are the people coming to understand this is a lost cause that could lead to World War III?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the same thing is happening today in Poland, where the Polish population, over 50%, have now said, okay, you can continue to supply things to Ukraine, but please, we don't want to become part of the war. And more recently, the various participants in the elections that are coming in the fall in Poland have now taken a position that Poland is more important than Ukraine, that Poland comes before Ukraine. Isn't that an interesting idea? It's called Poland First.
Gee.
Things are definitely happening across Europe as well as here in the United States. But again, who has the money? The donors have the money. Who are the donors? The donors call the tune. People in Washington respond to donors. And then there's this other really extremely dangerous aspect of the whole thing, which is, well, okay, things aren't going so well in Ukraine. We've done the best we can. These Ukrainians couldn't make it happen, but stand by. We have a new dangerous enemy threatening the entire world and civilization as we know it. It's called China.
Oh, yeah.
And so we see 11 ships that are exercising in the Bering Strait, Russian and Chinese ships, and we are alarmed. We don't bother to point out to people that we routinely sail close to China with various naval flotillas, that our subs cruise the waters, that our carrier battle groups cruise nearby. We were just in the Taiwan Strait with some warships. So the attitude in China now is, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to do this to us, we're going to start doing this to you. This is the sort of mindlessness and stupidity that leads to war.
This led to World War I. I've said it from the beginning, and I'm just an amateur student looking in. I read widely, but I'm not a military man, but I studied World War I in detail, and I know about the guns of August, and I know how it started with one event of an assassination of the Archduke. Then this country reacted, then that country reacted, that country, and before you knew it, millions of men were slaughtered and turned into fertilizer.
Well, to reinforce your point, before Bismarck was fired by the Second German Emperor in 1889, Wilhelm II walked into his meeting with Bismarck and boasted that he has just sent his newest German warships into the Baltic. And Bismarck was horrified and said, why? He said, well, it's time these Russians knew who we were and that we are our own power in the Baltic.
I see.
And Bismarck said, that is a serious mistake. The Russians are insecure. No one wants to be reminded of their own weakness. And that's what you have done.
Oh,
you
wow.
need to get our ships out of the Baltic immediately. Well, you know, this was the problem that the Kaiser had completely misread the Russians, misread Britain, misread France. Everybody misread Germany. The Kaiser was very proud of his Navy, but that didn't mean he wanted a war. He certainly didn't. Bismarck was the only adult in the room. And Bismarck said, this is nonsense. Why are we cruising up and down the Chinese coast? Why are we behaving that there is an imminent attack ready to go against Taiwan when there isn't?
Is not.
No. And the people on Taiwan aren't interested in a war with China. If anything, if they put it to a referendum, I would bet heavily that they would willingly join China, provided the Chinese treat them as they already do, essentially as business partners, trade with them, but don't insist on ruling them constantly from the lowest to the highest level.
I don't think Jake Sullivan agrees with your viewpoint.
Well, there you go. I'm going to worry about that now. I probably won't sleep tonight.
People don't even know who he is, but he's the one who looks like the fellow from Laurel and Hardy, the skinny one. Every time I see Jake Sullivan, he looks like that character from Laurel and Hardy. I think it's Stan Laurel. Only he's not a comedian.
Laurel was actually more articulate in many ways.
but this is not a comedy act. This is life and death. 400,000 dead Ukrainians, 30 to 40,000 dead Russians, satellite imagery of new graves being dug in Ukraine. show this to be the case. 50,000 Americans were killed in the Vietnam War, and that was a national tragedy that ripped the hearts out of many Americans. Now multiply that by 10-fold. With a country 1/4 the size population of this country, and maybe the American idiot will understand there's more to life than what's on TikTok or someone's abs or breasts. I've never seen anything like this, and it's only going to get worse. I think we have to say that we have no leadership, but who is the adult in the room? Is there anyone saying stop the war before it's too late in the administration that you know of?
No, on the contrary, I noted there was some Republican named Sullivan from Alaska who was applauding.
I saw that.
Some sort of robust military response against the evil Chinese and Russians
I saw that. Crazy.
Conducting an exercise in the Bering Straits in international waters.
Crazy. I saw that. There's not even a Republican screaming out against this.
Yeah, war has become too profitable. War is too rewarding, and they're too dumb to understand that the population of the United States, the overwhelming majority of people in the electorate, are not interested in going to war with anybody.
Colonel, you're a military guy. I have to keep repeating as a civilian. If I bang my finger in a door jamb or while I'm using a hammer and accidentally hit it, it hurts for weeks, if not months. That's just as a little hammer on a nail by accident. Do they understand what a battlefield wound looks like or is? No.
I don't think so. I think we've lost our fear of war. In the aftermath of World War II, there were generations of Americans who'd served in the Second World War, and then many more that served in Korea. These people had a very clear picture of what war was like. They saw it up close. They didn't want it. That's one of the reasons that Eisenhower was popularly elected. You'll remember he said, I promise I will go to Korea. He didn't say, I'm going to end it. He didn't say, I'm going to attack anybody. He said, I will go. And he went. And Mark Clark, of course, was the new commander at that point on the Korean Peninsula. And he received a briefing from Clark. And Clark's solution to the war in Korea was that he needed 850,000 men in the 8th Army in order to march into Manchuria and end the war.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eisenhower was polite to him, but he walked out of the tent and said, we've lost our minds. The United States isn't interested in going to war with China. We don't even want to be at war in Korea. And all you had to do was look at the polls, and it was overwhelmingly anti-war. And he said, that's it. I want an end to this. So I want a negotiated settlement based on the original status quo. And he was attacked. People attacked him and said, well, you're a coward. Here's Eisenhower. You're a coward. The man that ordered Normandy is a coward. It's absurd. We can go on and on about this nonsense, but this is what happens. Fortunately, most Americans agreed with Eisenhower, and it went away. It was dredged up subsequently, we know, by LBJ and that crowd, and it turned into a new catastrophe that never needed to happen.
Colonel, I'm hearing you. You're a military man and a scholar, a warrior and a scholar. What I see happening is that the instability that has been created by the Ukraine-Russia war is sending nervous waves throughout the entire population on the earth. And so smaller wars are now brewing because of that war in Ukraine-Russia. Most notably, we mentioned Serbia. I know there's trouble there, but on a larger scale is the Niger problem in Africa, the Niger coup. And Mark Wauk noted that Niger is rich in resources and a possible front in a World War III scenario. Niger provides almost all the uranium that France uses for its nuclear power plants, for example. Are we about to now send more? We have a base in Niger, don't we?
Well, we built a very, very wonderful airfield there that allows us to bring in and fly on enormous quantities of equipment and freight if we need to. In other words, it's militarily, it's strategically very useful to us. The thing that we have to keep in mind about this part of the world is that the French have very large investments, not just in Niger, but in the countries that surround it. This is, what you will remember as Afrique du Nord. This was part of the French Empire in Africa. When the French agreed to decolonize, they had certain codicils and arrangements that allowed French businesses to continue to enjoy access and, in many cases, monopolies. What's happened now is that the Africans who live there have said enough's enough. We want you out. We're sick of it. And we happen to be closely aligned with the French. We've worked with them against our mutual Islamist enemies. And what we haven't figured out is that you go into an area with the object of killing Islamists, and there were no Islamists when you went in. But by the time you get ready to leave, the place is full of them.
Oh, God.
Well, this is North Africa. This is exactly what's happened in Niger and elsewhere. I listened to the military leader who spoke in Niger through a translator, spoke very eloquently. And he said, look, Africa belongs to the Africans. You've got to get out. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. It's very simple. And I'm very sympathetic to him. I agree with him. And I argued when I was on active duty against this thing called AFRICOM. I said, Africa Command? If you were living in Africa and you found out that the United States, the world's leading superpower, had stood up a military command called Africa Command, how would you feel?
Well, it's just like the Africa Corps under Hitler, isn't it?
Well, it's a lot worse. Hitler only had 32,000 men in that thing. You know, the problem is that we've decided to control an entire continent if we're able to do so. And we've been pouring resources. And remember, all these people that we have been training, all these officers that we have been working hard to, quote unquote, democratize.
Yeah.
They're the ones that have launched these coups. We don't understand the underlying dynamics. We just refuse to come to terms with reality. People don't understand how important it is for us to demilitarize our relations with most of the world. We were really, really popular before World War II over most of the world because we didn't become involved in other people's business. We weren't invading their countries and trying to take them over. Everybody knew we were trying to get out of the Philippines within a year of having decided to occupy the place. You know, I mean, it was.
So, yeah, Colonel, I'm hearing this is history repeating itself. The militarists seem to always win. They lead us into war. Millions are killed. Lands are decimated. And then all of a sudden, people want peace. And then there's a small window of a few years, 10 years maybe, of no major conflict. It looks like we're entering a new major conflict one way or the other, whether it's Russia, China, or both. And now we look at the Middle East, Colonel, 3,000 U.S. military arrived in the Red Sea as tensions rise with Iran. Are there any other motives for sending these troops into the Red Sea? I'm sorry, in the area? What's going on in the Middle East now?
I don't know. I mean, I don't sign on for this. Look, the Iranians came to arrangements with the Peninsular Arabs. And the Peninsular Arabs now, surprise, surprise, have decided to renounce the Abraham Accords.
Wow.
They're effectively walking away from them.
That's horrible. After Trump brought the Arabs and Jews together.
Yeah, well, he was trying very hard to fashion a new status quo. He would have also approached Iran, I think, and we would be in a better place with Iran as well. But that was sabotaged by Pompeo and Bolton and others.
Oh.
We also went through the same sabotage effort when it came to North Korea. In other words, anybody who wanted to promote some degree of stability based on relations other than military ones has failed because the money is on the side of militarization of policy.
Here we go again. Follow the money. So, Colonel, before we go, put on your crystal ball hat. You've seen it all. You've lived it. You've seen it. You've studied it. Knowing history and knowing the battlefield, what's going to happen?
I think that we in the United States are finally going to confront limits to how much money we can print and how much further into debt we can go. That is going to operate as a brake on much of our activity. That's one thing. The second part of it is the situation here inside the United States, the breakdown in the rule of law.
Oh, boy. The
discontent in this country with everything from open borders and millions of people pouring in that we know nothing about. You know, the fact that, you know, we have no legislation that says until every American citizen who wants to work and can work has a job, no one comes in. Gee, think about that. Is that an idea? We are going to run up against a brick wall of our own making. Right? People are complaining, well, look what the Chinese are doing to our 401ks. They're not doing anything to our 401ks. The people on Wall Street have done that to you. If you don't like where your money is being invested, Talk to the people on Wall Street who are doing it to you. There's no sense. There is a growing sense now, finally, I think, that we are the authors of our own problems, and that will help. But consider this for a minute. This is a strategic viewpoint that is missing in Washington. You've talked about the fact that we now have multiple nations with nuclear weapons. We have Russia, we have China, we have the United States, we have India, Pakistan, Great Britain, France, North Korea. If you look at the scientific, industrial, and agricultural output of Northeast Asia, in other words, China, Korea, and Japan, then look at the same thing in Europe and North America, you very quickly ascertain that 80+% of the world's technology, its advances in every conceivable scientific area, all of it revolves around those two regions in the world. And I would include Israel, for instance, with Europe and North America, culturally. So the point is, if you look at those two regions and you realize the planet's future depends upon what those two regions do in science, technology, agriculture, energy, and so forth, why, under any circumstances, would you promote conflict between those two civilizational constructs? You'd be insane to do it, because if we end up in a major war with each other, the planet is going to face despair, famine, and catastrophe.
So are you fearing that that's what will happen, knowing history?
Well, I fear that there's no one like Bismarck in the councils of government who says, wait a minute, be sensitive to the countries that surround you, be sensitive to their interests and needs. I love President Trump, and I supported him, and I still do, but he keeps talking about his good personal relations with Xi and good personal relations with Putin. Look, that's all nonsense. Mm-hmm. Everything is about strategic interests. Mm-hmm. If we will look at their strategic interests and our own, we will discover very quickly that we can come to some sort of modus vivendi that we can all live with. Mm. That's what diplomats get paid to do. And that's what we desperately need.
Well, when Kissinger came out 6 or so months ago and called for a peace talks, he was called every name under the sun by the American left and right. And of course, as I've said, not so comedically, when the G7 meeting was about to occur, he changed his tune because he didn't want to be excluded. He definitely wanted to be invited into the Billionaires Boys Club meeting again at the G7. So suddenly he called for more war. I don't see any diplomacy. Is there any that you know of through your contacts?
No, listen, I think that Blinken and his friends are in the business of punishing people that don't agree with him.
Who is this Blinken? He worked for Obama.
Don't agree with him.
Blinken worked for Obama. Is that all I need to say?
Probably, but he was also there during the Balkan crisis in the background. And I know his father played a role in all of this.
His father?
Yeah, his father, I think, was the ambassador to Hungary.
Well, I know that Madeleine Halfbright cheered the war on with that Jamie Rubin moron. This woman was a clear and present danger to the stability of the world. They were cheering as the bridges over the Danube were being blown up. The Serbs had never seen that. Even when Hitler was there, they didn't blow the bridges up over the Danube. That was Bill Clinton. They took our airplanes and they painted over the U.S. insignia and put on the NATO insignia. You used U.S. air power to attack Serbia. I couldn't believe what I was watching. We're not yet there with this situation, but I'm afraid personally we'll soon see that they'll repaint our Air Force planes with NATO insignia and start bombing Russia. That could happen.
It won't make any difference on radar. The Russians can identify all of our aircraft on radar, so they're not going to be fooled by different insignia. Right now, our airborne warning and control systems are identifying targets for the Ukrainians, are directing strikes that the Ukrainians launch.
Like our AWACS or our satellites?
Sure, and satellites. Our satellites and our airborne warning and control system. And we do this for all of the NATO states as well as for the Ukrainians. So we're very active in the Black Sea and the Baltic, all up and down the Russian border with regard to targeting the Russians.
So the Russians...
They know this, and they've decided to exercise restraint. The question is, how much longer?
Could they shoot down our AWACS?
Oh, of course.
How high do their air defense systems fly?
High enough, up to
High
30,
enough.
40,000 feet. And then they have some that'll reach up to low Earth orbit, 70, 80, 90,000 feet. They have the ability to launch special weapons that can attack our satellites.
Why
They
haven't
haven't done it
Why haven't they done that?
because they don't want us to attack theirs. And we haven't attacked their satellites. Now, they have jammed a lot of our satellite communications and jammed a lot of our missile systems and aircraft. But in terms of kinetic action, no, they've been very careful to avoid that. And I hope that we can find a way to get out of this before something happens by accident. Somebody pushes the wrong button on the panel.
Well, that's a cheerful thought. We've covered the ground of the Earth. Is there anything I've missed in terms of what might explode in our faces? See, you're a man who can
I'm
laugh.
sure.
You can laugh. You can smile and laugh in the midst of this kind of tragic discussion.
I'm sure if we look closely enough into Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, we can find lots of activity down there that is very dangerous to the United States.
I was told that a lot of the weaponry that we're sending to Ukraine is going onto the black market almost immediately. And I asked another guest, "Where's it going?" They said to the narco terrorists in South America. Can you confirm? Is that what's being?
I've seen photographs of Javelin missiles being and their equipment being carried by drug cartel soldiers, if you will. In
Those
Mexico.
are the javelins that we sent to Zelensky's boys.
Yes.
How are they winding up shipped out immediately?
Well, a certain amount of equipment never reaches the Ukrainians. Some of it is destroyed, and a lot of it is essentially stolen and then resold overseas. Kosovo is a nice clearinghouse for a lot of these weapons. They go down there and they find their way into the Middle East or off to Latin America and Africa. I mean, this is the problem. Remember, Ukraine was the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt in the world, and the poorest in Europe. Why are we surprised about any of these things?
Hush, hush, my friend. We must keep these things secret, or else we will be accused of being, let's see, Putin's stooges, defeatists, anti-American, communists, Soviet slaves, any other slurs that can be cast upon us.
Well, the next time I'm sure you'll want to bring a guest on and talk about the Sovietization of American society, because that seems to be a bigger threat right now here at home than anything happening overseas.
Colonel, I don't mean to be the one who says it, but I'm going to say it. I wrote a book 10 years ago talking about the USS of A, the United Soviet States of America. I amongst many, not many, I amongst a few, saw what was coming. I just had a relative come back from Europe. I must ask you this question, and I don't know how to discuss this without exposing too much personal information. He saw a lack of civil rights and freedom in France, and he was shocked as an American who was visiting on a boat. Some gendarmes came aboard this vessel and accused them of things that they didn't do. And I said, "You're lucky they didn't seize the boat for no reason." He said, "We had to pay them. When they found there were nothing wrong, no one did anything wrong, they said, you owe us €1,000, seven armed gendarmes on this boat in Monaco." He said, "We didn't do anything." They said, "We don't care. Pay it or we're going to take your boat." He said, "I can't believe that there's absolutely no justice and no freedom." I said, "You're very lucky you got out of there with only €1,000 fine for doing nothing." He said to me that he sees America devolving rapidly into this state of lawlessness and no rights. And I am always the eternal optimist, as pessimistic as I can be, saying we're still protected by constitutional rights that the French do not enjoy. And I think that's all we have left. Isn't that true?
Well, I try to argue that the Bill of Rights, above all things, is what absolutely must be preserved inside the United States. We talk about the Constitution. The Constitution describes how our government will be structured. We can change that over time. There's nothing sacrosanct about a structure developed in the 1780s. We can make modifications, but the Bill of Rights is something else. That's something that definitely separates us from most of the rest of the world. And that has to be fought for. And right now, that's under attack in this country. All you have to do is look at the censorship.
Well, the Bill of Rights, didn't the British have the Magna Carta that ruled the land for so long, and they basically tossed it into the sea?
Well, they don't have a Bill of Rights as we understand it. And so a lot of the things that we take for granted do not exist in Great Britain. The same thing is true in Europe. Remember, most of the law on the continent has its roots in the Code Napoleon.
Yes.
That's a different approach to law, where you are guilty until proven innocent.
Well, that's something that Nancy Pelosi agrees with, because
Right.
Napoleon would be one of her heroes. You have a statue. I have a statue of Napoleon in my house.
Napoleon was a much better human being than Pelosi.
I like Napoleon, the little bit that I knew about, until I found that there were people who hate him. I had no idea he was seen as the Hitler of his time, by the way, by many Europeans.
Well, especially the British.
Colonel, always enlightening, not a pleasure. Never a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Can't help it.
But always enlightening. And I admire you enormously, and I hope you keep this drumbeat going, because I do think that you are making a big difference. I know you're appearing widely now, and people are taking you much more seriously than they did initially, where they said you were this and that. I think your message is resonating. It's seeping out of the, what should we say, the social media, which is, you're not being interviewed by CBS Nightly News, are you?
No, that hasn't happened yet.
Well, they haven't come around to vilify you. Be careful.
Well, thanks very much. And God bless you and everybody listening.
Colonel, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.